to get really clear on what it is that you want. I'm in the position now where I work with hundreds of business owners, and most of them have gotten lost on the journey and forgotten why they started in the first place. And the truth is that we usually tend to overcomplicate what we're doing. We usually tend to add on more than we want, make it more expensive than it needs to be. And if you really get in touch with what is the result that you want, what is the lifestyle you want, and you build your business around that, you'll avoid a lot of detours that are unnecessary. And the last thing you want to do is to build a successful business 20 years from now, look back and say, I don't even like what I built. I don't even like where I'm at. And that's what a lot of people are on the path to do.
Everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of the Inventive Journey. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where we help startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. If you ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com and grab some time to chat with us. Now, today we have a fun guest on here, and we'll get to a little bit of his intro, but it was fun. It was one of the, I think it was either I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the first podcasts I was on, or had an opportunity to be a guest on, which is he does the Profit with Law podcast. So it's one, if you're an attorney or doing legal related services, that is a great podcast, and one that I definitely recommend and listen to frequently myself. But with that, it was one that I kind of started a bit of my podcasting experience and has grown since then, and was a genesis in part on this podcast. And so excited to turn around a bit and have him as a guest on the podcast for once, and to talk to a little bit of his journey. So with that, we will go ahead and dive into a bit of his journey and have a good conversation. So welcome on the podcast, Moshe.
Oh, thank you so much, Devin, for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I mean, I love podcasting. I listened to podcasts back when you had to download it and put it on an iPod. So I'm an avid podcast listener, and I love the opportunity to be on somebody else's show. So I appreciate you having me here, and hopefully I can add value to your listeners.
Absolutely. No, it's always fun. It's fun to be on both sides of the microphone, so to speak, of being able to be the host as well as to be the guest. And it's always a different experience. So now I'll just congratulate you in front of the audience. So Moshe just had a child. Is that right?
Yep. A baby boy.
Baby boy. So if you get tired or you're not off or anything else, definitely understand why, because I have 4 kids that are ages 5 to 11, so been through that 4 times, and definitely understand the little bit of the losing sleep and otherwise being distracted. So appreciate you fitting us in after having the newborn.
Yeah, you know what? I'm just trying to catch up to you. This is my sixth child, but my 3 older ones are, much older. So I want to get that bunch of 4 in that small age group. So just give me a couple more years. We'll be back and talk about the 4th one.
All right. Well, it's good aspirations, and it's definitely a good goal to shoot for. So, well, with that, we'll go ahead and dive in. And as the listeners are used to, we do go through the journey of kind of how you got to where you're at today. So maybe give an introduction, start at that high school, college timeframe, but kind of give us an idea of how your journey got started and led to where you're at.
Yeah, it's, you know what, everybody's got their own unique journey, and mine is definitely unique. So I don't know how many of your listeners have been exposed to the Orthodox Jewish community, but I was raised an Orthodox Jew, and I didn't necessarily buy into the way of life that Orthodox Jewry provided. So being an Orthodox Jew has a lot of limitations on what you can do. It's very restrictive. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was in constant rebellion. So my high school journey was very interesting because give me a year and I was in a different high school. So I bounced around.
Just to clarify, so you went to 4 different high schools over 4 years?
That's correct.
All right.
That's correct. So whether it was my doing or their doing, and somehow either they didn't want me back or I didn't want to go back, and gave my parents a run for their money for sure. But it was all private schools, and the first one was way too religious for me. I was just there was two different things at play. One is I'm very smart. I don't want to toot my own horn. That's not the point, but the classes were boring to me. I would read the textbook in the first 3 weeks of school, and I knew the curriculum for the year. So the rest of the year was just how can I enjoy myself in the process. So I'd be sitting in the back of the room, and I was the jokester in the class, and I would, constantly eating snacks during class, stuff like that. And that was just how I carried on through high school. But I never really found my place because I just wasn't comfortable with where I was. And in that process, my father has been I don't want to call it an entrepreneur. I think there's a better word for it, but he was constantly doing a new business every couple of years, but he never hired staff. So it was always like solopreneur, in an entrepreneurial fashion. But he was always looking for the next, get rich quick scheme, and never really built a business the way that a business needs to be built, which is to bring on people to do the job that you'd be doing, and then you reap the rewards. So in his venture of not hiring staff, he put his kids to work. So I have a very eclectic background throughout my childhood. We had a flower shop. We had a gold refinery. These all happened in our basement, by the way. We had a business where he would buy all this inventory that couldn't be sold, and then we'd sit down and say, okay, why didn't this sell? So there was like a board game called Plutocrat that when you open the box, there were no instructions. So there's a whole bunch of game pieces, but it doesn't tell you how to play. So like, oh, of course this didn't sell. So we sat there and we made up a game, and then we wrote up a rule book, and we repackaged the game nicely and with the instructions inside. And then he turned around and sold it for a profit. So those are the kinds of things that I was being exposed to as I was growing up. And when I was in high school, he partnered with a Israeli software company that was creating Jewish software for Talmud and the Old Testament and stuff like that. So there's like Bible Scholar and Torah Scholar, and the Talmud Scholar was the names of the software. And he basically was starting their North American division. This is the only work that he did that he actually brought on staff. So he hired these support personnel to take tech support calls, and I would come in at night from school. And of course, I did my homework on the way home, and I was bored when I got home, and I would sit there in the office and I would answer the support line. I would start helping people with their computer problems. And most of these people were they just didn't know how to operate the computer. So you just needed to kind of like walk them through where they needed to go. But it let my parents know that I had a knack for technology. So after my stint of 4 years,
walk through, and within at least 4 years, you went from board game salesman. You did flower shop, you did gold refinery, and you did IT customer service. At least those.
Not all that happened during high school. So that was, I don't know the time span of that, but my guess is probably like third, fourth grade, okay, all the way through the end of high school. But this software company was the last 2-3 years that I was in high school was when the software company was happening. Ultimately, they ended up taking it back over. He stepped away. He just, again, it came back to, he likes to own the tasks. And I don't want to make this about my dad, but he likes to own the tasks. And I think he had a really hard time with the delegation aspect. So it really didn't work out. And he moved on to the next thing that he set out to do, which is Microsoft Access Database programming, which he's still doing today, interestingly enough.
So he's been
doing that the longest.
So now he found his niche. Now on your journey, as you're saying, okay, had this kind of bounced around through different high schools, also was doing entrepreneurial endeavors, and you're now saying, okay, I'm graduating from high school. Was it a straight shot to college? And, what did you figure out, or how did you figure out what you wanted to do in college, or kind of how did that next phase of your journey go?
Okay, so the interesting thing is that in there's different gradations of Orthodox Jews, but the modern Orthodox they feed into the college system just like the rest of America. But the rest of the Orthodox community, they either don't go to college or they only go as needed. Like, so they stay and study Torah for a certain amount of time, and then when they're ready to go out into the workforce, maybe they'll go to college, maybe they just start working. So I was not being groomed to go to college. That wasn't part of the plan. And college really wasn't on the radar. When I finished 12th grade, I really didn't have anything that I needed to do. Like, what's the next step? Like, the normal next step for somebody in the circles I was being brought up in was to go to a Talmudic college, which is, they don't call it that, but that's basically what it is. And I had no interest in doing that. So here I was, an adult. I can make my own decisions. I'm not taking that step. So what did I do? I went out with friends, and I live in a suburb of New York City. So I went into Manhattan every night and we went clubbing. So I'd be out until 3, 4 in the morning. I'd come home. And what do you do when you're up till 4 in the morning? You sleep till 1 in the afternoon. So I was at this place where I really had no purpose. And as far as my mother was concerned, she raised a bum. And she was like totally like she was
Probably
torn up
fair
about it.
assumption on her end that at least the outward perspective, that is what it would probably look like.
Yeah, so she was really, really mortified by what had happened, and she said, "You know what? He needs to have some sort of responsibility." So she went to a local computer store, and she had a conversation with the owner, and she said, "Look, my son really doesn't have direction in his life right now, and I really think that he'd be amazing at whatever you do in your computer store. Would you take him in?" And he said, "I'd like to meet him first, but yeah, I'd probably give him a shot." So my mother comes home and she says, "I set up an interview with you for you, and just go meet with this computer store owner." So I was like, "Oh, what the heck? Why not?" So I went and I sat down with him, and he basically told me what they did, which at that time, what a computer cost $2,500. So there was a big business to just assemble and sell computers, because if you bought it from Dell for $2,500, we can assemble it with the bare material costing about $500-600, and we can make that $2,000 profit, right? So there was a big business in actually just creating, building the computers and selling it to the clients. So he basically said, "Look, I'll take you on as an intern, and the first moment that I can send you out to a client site to work and you're able to bill on your own is when I'll start paying you, and I'll pay you $200 a week cash." So 3 weeks later, I went on payroll, and I was doing that for a very short period of time. Probably, if I had to guess, probably about 4 months. And he sent me out to a client in New York City, and I'm at the client. The way that he did this was he would have you go with a book, like just a blank receipt book that had a carbon copy, and you'd write a bill when you were there. So he had us call before we left the site and write a bill. So I called him up and I said, "Okay, this is what I did. I basically spent an hour there, and I did, I tweaked a couple of things in their software and I fixed their problem." They were happy as can be. And he had me write the bill, and he had me write a bill for $90 for my hour of work. And he also had me add another $50 for travel. And I handed a $140 bill to them, and they gave me $140 back. And in my infinite wisdom of business, I came back and I said, "I want a raise."
Hey, I made you money. Give me more. So how did that go?
I looked at it. I said, "He's billing me at $90 an hour." Quick math. That's $3,600 a week. I'm getting $200 a week. Something's wrong here, right? Now, clearly, I wasn't billing at 40 hours a week, but that was my mindset. So I asked for a raise. He said, "I'm going on vacation to Israel. When I come back, let's talk about it." He went on vacation. I think he's coming back, and I'm going to be a rich man. And he gets back and he says, "I really thought about it, and I'm not in the position to give you a raise right now." And I said, what do you mean you're not in the position to give me a raise?
You're making $90 an hour off of me. How can you not
right.
give me a raise?
Well, you get me to $300 an hour. It only takes 3.5 hours for me to break even for you every week. Like this is a no brainer. But bottom line is that I came home and I told my mother what happened. And she said, well, I have somebody that I want you to meet. And she puts me in touch with the IT company that was doing the IT support for her office. And I went and I met with them, and they turned around and offered me a real job with a real paycheck where I get to pay my taxes on it. And and I started working for them.
For having to pay the tax. Well, you should pay your tax as you have to, but yeah.
Right. Well, I was getting $200 cash, and as a teenager earning cash, taxes wasn't on my radar. None of that, none of that adult stuff was there, but I was earning money, but I realized that I was not earning enough that made sense for what the work that I was doing. And that the next job I got, I think I started there at $23,000 a year salary. But while I was there, a few things happened. Number one, the owner of the business, it was a Novell shop. Novell is something that nobody today knows what it is, but what Microsoft is today, Novell was back then. So essentially they had the server business for small businesses or even large businesses. Everything ran on Novell NetWare. And Microsoft was new to the game when it came to server side, corporate networks. And there was a certification called a Microsoft Certified Systems Engineer, where you can get certified on the Microsoft Server operating system. And that was a 6-exam certification. And it was, at the time, was very valuable. At the same time, I got married. Now, mind you, I'm 19 years old, and I got married. And that goes back to the way I was raised, the Jewish Orthodox traditions, and you can't really be with a woman unless you're married. So I fell in love with a girl, and the only way for us to be together was to get married. So that's what I did. Now, I don't have any qualms with what happened with my life and where that took me, but at 19, before I turned 20, I already had my first child. And so my oldest is now 22. She also works for me. She's a podcast producer here at my podcast, Profit with Law. And she's a college student at SUNY Empire State. But I am 42 years old. I've got a 22-year-old daughter. So at 19, I had just gotten married, and I had now a pregnant wife. And I started to realize that my $23,000 salary ain't going to cut it. And that's where I think that a lot of my motivation on my career path was driven by necessity rather than by what I desired or wanted or thought about that I wanted to do, because it was one step after another, always trying to keep abreast with the added responsibilities I created for myself. So I went into my new boss. I was there, 9 months or 8 months when this happened. And I said, look, I want to know if there's a way for me to earn more money here. And he said, well, yeah, actually there is. If you get this Microsoft certification, then I will give you a raise, and I'll raise you from 23,000 to 27,000. So I went through and I built my own 2 computers at home, and I made a server and a workstation, and I went through the material and I took the tests, and I worked really hard to get the certification. And when I was done, it was right around the time that my baby was born, and I went in, I got my raise, and I was feeling really good. And then I read an article that said that the average MCSC was making $70,000 a year.
Yeah, like, I got a raise and I'm way underpaid.
Exactly. So I started to shop around what's out there, and I ended up getting a job at a pre-IPO company. Now, mind you, this is 1999, and everybody was going public. So like the place to be was a pre-IPO company.
Now, let me just ask one question on that. So you're working at Novell, and just as a complete aside, so some of the listeners, at least I know who Novell is because it was started in Utah. So because it was started in Utah, and it was actually started in Provo, which is where I went to school for undergrad, there's at least a very tangential connection between between Novell and why I would actually know what it is. Because you're right, most people would remember it. But now you go before you made the jump to going to kind of the pre-IPO. Did you go into the boss? Did you say, hey, I can make double if I go somewhere else? Or he's just saying, hey, we're not in a position to pay you? Or kind of what made you decide to make that leap or make that jump from working to Novell, which was a big company at the time, to going to more of a pre-IPO company?
So it's exactly how it happened. So the owner of this business that's basically was a computer support company. It was a small shop. There were 5 of us that were working for him. He was in his 70s. And I went into him and I said, look, I really appreciate what you're paying me. I appreciate you taking me in. I'm working hard for you. I know that we're making money. I don't know if it can support this, but here's what the industry is paying people that are doing what I'm doing with the amount of experience that I have. Is there anything that you can do to improve my salary? And he said, no, that's the best that I can do. And my recollection may be off. I think he may have given me a small raise. I think he may have bumped me up another few $1,000s, but that was it. Then I went and I found a job, and the job was going to pay me $54,000 was the salary. So it was practically double or just shy of double of what I was earning. So I went into him and I said, look, I now have a job offer. Before I take it, I just want to double check. Nothing doing here. And he said, nope, nothing doing. And I said, okay, here's my 2 weeks notice. So at that exact moment, he called everybody together into the office, into the conference room. And he said, I just want you all to know I'm retiring. And Moshe's leaving. He got another job. And I'm going to, if you guys want it, these 2 people, I'm going to hand the clients off to you. We'll make some financial arrangements. And that was it. My exodus was basically the demise of the company that I was at. Not my doing. He was
that held the company together.
Well, I think he was ready. I think he was like, and I think he knew it was coming. So I think he waited until he didn't have to let another person go. And it just gave him the peace of mind that he can move on and retire in peace. Right. So I started at the software company. At the software company, I did most of the work on the team that I was on. A lot of the guys were smokers, and every 15 minutes they went on smoking breaks. And I ended up carrying the bag for a lot of the work they did. And I turned around and very quickly asked for a raise from them. And they turned around, and my manager basically gave me the runaround for a while, and ultimately came back and said he can do an $800 raise. And
I guess it's better than nothing, but not a whole lot.
Yeah, it was like and basically the conversation he had with me was very like, this is not how to have employees. He calls me into the office and he says, MCSEs are a dime a dozen. So I was able to work out an $800 raise for you. Like, you owe me the world. So at that time, it was shortly thereafter, I walked into my father's house, and it was a Sunday morning. He was meeting with a gentleman who was installing a phone system in his house. So he was having this meeting with this guy, and I walked in and I said hi, and I said hello to this person, and I went up to talk to my mother. And when I walked out of the room, he turns to my father and he says, "Oh, what does he do?" And my father says, "Oh, he's in computers. He does networking, blah, blah, blah." He says, "Well, I have a company that does phone systems. I would love to add computer networking to the mix of what we do. Is he looking for a job?" So my father tells him, "I don't think so. He just started at this, this other place."
Just barely started. Why would he be looking already?
Yeah. So he turns around and tells me this conversation. And I said, "Well, wait a second. I want to hear what he has to say." So I sat down with him and I had a conversation with him. And he told me what he wanted to do, what his vision was. And I said, "I would love to start your IT division for you. I'd love to be your director of IT." I said, "I don't have the experience of managing people. I understand that you're taking a risk with me, but I've never let any of my employers down. I've always worked really hard. I've always made sure to get the job done, and I will do the same for you." I said, and on top of, so he wanted to know what I wanted to earn. I said $70,000 a year. And he hemmed and hawed, and he wasn't sure. I said, I'll tell you what, I see that this is a difficult dollar amount for you to swallow. I said, I will start at 60,000. I'll work for 3 months. If after 3 months you're not happy with my work, you think that you made a mistake, I walk away. You saved a little bit of money. If you are happy, you give me a raise to 70. And he agreed, and I started working there. I ended up working for him for 6 years. And I developed his IT department into a dozen technicians. I flew all across the country. I sold over $30 million in sales for him. And it was it was a great place to land. It was a great place for me to flourish. But more importantly, it gave me a ton of experience in basically starting a business, running a business where I didn't have the same challenges as somebody who owns a business does, because I didn't have to worry about where the money was coming from necessarily. Right. So I didn't lose sleep at night, but I learned a ton about vetting people, hiring the right people, managing them, criticizing them in a way that's constructive, and be able to get them to be team players and work with you. It was a very impactful job for me. But during that time, and I know that we're probably going to be running out of time soon, so I'll try to rush the story up a little bit. During that time, I went through my divorce. And it was the last couple of years I was working for him. And when I went through my divorce, I basically, my ex-wife wasn't working and I was. And I was earning, at that point, I was already earning over six figures. I actually got to $100,000 in salary before I turned 21. And I owned my first home before I turned 22. So I was like really always on this fast track of rushing to get somewhere. Where I was rushing to, who knows? But I always thought that
somewhere.
Well, you know what? I have this belief that, people work their whole lives to reach retirement, and then they get to retirement, they get to enjoy life, and they're too old to enjoy it.
I agree. It's like finally when you have your house paid for, you have the money, you have the means, and then you're saying, now I'm too tired, I'm too old, and I can't do anything to enjoy everything that I built. And so then it almost seems backwards. But when you're young, so it's kind of, retirement is wasted on the old, and there's some truth to that. So now help us.
So I had this idea that I would have all my kids out of high school and, through college. By the time I was 45, I'd be retired and I'd be able to live and enjoy life. So, that's what I was always on this rush, because I had created this time frame for myself that was a lot shorter than what most people would have their careers in. Now, mind you, I never went to college at this point. And I also had something that I was doing on the side. So I was an EMT, an emergency medical technician, volunteering for the local ambulance corps. And that was something that I just did as a hobby on the side. It had nothing to do with, my career. So I went through my divorce, and in the process, first of all, my work fell off the cliff when my head wasn't in the game. I wasn't motivated. Like, everything that was motivating me was my family, and my family was falling apart. And then I got to this realization where logistically it made sense, since I was the breadwinner, that I would have the kids only one night a week and every other weekend, and she would have them all the other times, which, in hindsight, that was the stupidest thing for me to agree to, but it is what it is. Water under the bridge.
It made sense, and it worked, or you thought it would work, and come to find out it's a bit different, right?
So then I had all this free time in the evenings, and I was like, what am I going to do with it? So I actually decided to join a paramedic program and put myself through paramedic school. And the paramedic program is a 2,000-hour program. So that's like the equivalent of a full-time job. And I was doing this while working my job. So I would leave work and I would go to class in the evenings. We had class from 7 to 11. And then I had to do 3 8-hour rotations a week at the hospital. So some nights I would stay there, do my 8-hour rotation from 11 to 7, and then go to work at 7 a.m. the next morning. And sometimes I did it on the weekend when I didn't have the kids. Somehow I balanced it. I figured it all out. It was a very difficult year, but at least I felt like I was doing something. At the same time that I finished my medic program, things really got bad at work. The company wasn't doing well. They were having a hard time. My performance had fallen off the map. Most of my team was already gone, and my boss started to fall behind in payroll. And it got to the point where I was like, you know what? There's no future for me here. I went into his office and I said, look, either catch me up or I'm gone. And he said, okay, see ya.
Thank you for donating the extra money that I didn't pay you. So now that's kind of fast forward. So you're saying, okay, I'm in a transitional point in life. Going through divorce. You're also saying, okay, I'm going to do EMT school. Now, where we intersected was a bit more of now with profit with law, which is more on finance,
right?
Business. So how did you make that jump or that transition? Because it seems like it's a fairly big departure from what you were used to or what you were doing before then.
Yeah. So what happened is I started working full time as a paramedic, and a paramedic on a 911 unit, it could be a very adrenaline rushing job. It could be very emotionally draining. But one thing that it had was a lot of downtime. So there was all this time that I was sitting there, and what do they do? Right? They sit and watch TV. Right. So I'm sitting there, I'm in the medic station, and I'm 3 hours downtime between calls or whatever it is, and we're watching TV. And at some point I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Like, why am I not being more productive with this time? I'm getting paid for it. I may as well do something with it. And that's when I said, you know what? I'm going to go to school. I'm going to get my bachelor's degree. I never did it. I always wanted to do it. I'm going to do it. So I enrolled at SUNY Empire State, which had an adult learning, distance learning program. And I started going for my bachelor's. And when I had to start selecting what my major was going to be or what classes I wanted to take, I knew that business was where I wanted to be, but I looked at my experience and I said, what am I missing from my experience? And I realized that I never was involved in the financial side of the business. I was only involved in operations. So I honed in on accounting. And that's when I started saying, oh, maybe I want to be a CPA. Maybe, that's where I want to go. And ultimately, what I ended up doing was I got my bachelor's and I went for my MBA, did all of that right through. And then things started changing in my life. Like I met my wife, my current wife now, and I started to settle down. And when I started to settle down, my medic salary really wasn't cutting it. It wasn't even cutting it before because most of it was going to child support and private school tuition for my children. But now, if I want to start life with somebody else, I really have to get serious about the money that I'm making. So the knee-jerk reaction, instant, solution to the problem was to go back to IT. So I did. I went back to IT. And I did that, and I did medic full time 3 nights a week. So it was 3 12-hour shifts a week at night, and I did IT during the day, all while I was a full time student. So I wasn't
busy at all. Didn't have much on your plate, right?
Right, exactly. So that was a really busy time in my life. But then I found out that my ex-wife was an alcoholic. Basically, kids moved in with me. Once that happened, I couldn't work at night anymore. It just didn't work for my wife to be a primary parent for them. So that, I had to cut back on my medic hours. And that's when I really, when that happened, that's when I really started to look at my life and say, what am I doing? Like, I've always worked for somebody, but I never wanted to work for somebody. And now I've got my kids going through this crisis, and every day I'm running them to therapy appointments, to Alateen meetings, and I'm constantly needing to ask permission to do that. I don't want to. I want to just be able to be a dad to them in the way that feels natural to me without needing somebody's permission for that. And that's really where I started to say, okay, I really want to start my own business. I want to work for myself. And the seed was planted. Ultimately, that was 2014 is when I started that journey. It wasn't until 2019 where I settled on who I was serving and how I was going to serve them. So it took me 5 years to really, what's that?
I was going to say, it took you about 5 years. And that's what I like to hit on is that, it always feels like when you read the book, you listen to the podcast, you watch the movie, it's, I was an overnight success. And, it just, everything clicked and exactly what happened. And it was this fluid journey and everything was perfect. And it's 99.9% of the time, it's never the case. And even once you made the jump, it still took you 5 years to figure out where you wanted to focus on and what you wanted to drill down on.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that finally, like the end of 2018, beginning of 2019 is when I realized that attorneys was who I'm going to be working with. But even then, I still didn't have clarity on what I was doing for them, because initially I was setting up a traditional accounting firm. But ultimately, that's not what I wanted to do. And when I started to really look at the impact I wanted to have and how I wanted to help people, I realized that what I really want to do is help people be successful. And I didn't want to just look at people's past results and tell them how to save money on their taxes and that be the end of it. I really wanted to work with people to help them figure out how to turn their business into a cash generating machine and then figure out what to do with that cash later. right? So that they can make a difference in not only their own lives, but also their kids' lives. Real quick tangent. This was all motivated by an experience I had from my grandfather. So my grandfather came from Nazi Germany when he was 11 years old with his father. He lost his mother and his twin siblings in the war. And when they came over, I think they went to Israel first, then they came to the US. When they came, they really had nothing. His father had sent over, I think he sent over some diamonds. So he had an orange orchard over in Germany. And he was very well connected. He was a businessman, and basically he was an orange merchant. And when the war started to happen, because he was well connected, he was getting intel from top officials, really telling him what's going on. So I think he took his entire family fortune and converted it into diamonds and pre-sent it to the U.S. So when he finally ended up here in the U.S., he had merchandise to sell. And he started a diamond business in Manhattan. Ultimately, my grandfather worked in that business with him, and was successful with that business, to the point where he and 4 of his cousins decided to buy a piece of real estate. They bought an apartment building on the west side of Manhattan. And now that move looks genius, looking at it 60 years later or whatever it was.
Right.
But that investment that he made in himself and his family's future bore significant results, to the tune of he gave each of his 36 grandchildren the down payment for their first home purchase. And he also helped put each of us through private school, and our children through private school. So every year part of my kids' tuition was paid for by my grandfather. And being on the recipient side of that, it had such a major impact on my life. It's a minor thing. Like, in the grand scheme of things, when we become older, we realize that $40,000 is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. It really, it's not really that big a deal. But for him to be able to provide it to us at that moment in our life, when it was so significant, and allowed us to get a step, towards home ownership and being able to settle down, it was such a blessing to have. That's really what's motivating me to help others create something like that for their families.
Oh, and I think that's an awesome story, and it's kind of fun to see how the generational impact of something that happened generations back is continuing to both impact you from a financial, but also from a direction you've taken your life and your business. So I think that's definitely fun to hear. So, well, as we wrap up, and we could go on for much longer, and I'm sure we'd have a great conversation. So we'll have to have you back on. I'd love to have you on. We do an expert episode, and it's a bit different flavor than the journey, but we get to talk and share your expertise. And I always love listening to your podcast and sharing your expertise. So maybe we'll have to have you back on in the future. But as we wrap towards the end of this podcast, and now we've kind of caught up a bit to your journey, definitely encourage people to check out your podcast with Profit with Law, and also all the services you guys offer. But I always ask 2 questions at the end of each podcast. So we'll jump to those now. So the first question I always ask is, we've talked a lot about your journey, and along your journey, what was the worst business decision you ever made, and what did you learn from it?
Well, the worst decision that I shouldn't say decision. The worst thing that could have happened to me along my journey at the time was going through divorce. But when I look back at the journey and I say, well, where did I end up? I would never have ended up here had I not done that. Right. So when you're going through that crisis, it feels like the world's falling apart and this is the worst thing that could have happened to you. But it's part of the journey. And, I am where I am because of lots of decisions that I made on the heels of that. But that's not the business decision. So the one business decision that I regret, that I wish that I could have done differently, is simply how long I waited. So I started my business moonlighting. So I started building my business while I was working as an employee. And I'm sure a lot of people do this. And I did it out of necessity because I have to put food on the table. I had a mortgage to pay. I had kids to put, kids' school tuition to pay. I had, mouths to feed. So I had this need, and based on the need, I felt like I wasn't ready to take the plunge. Ultimately, what ended up happening is I built up clients to a certain point, and then I couldn't serve them. My service would fall off the map, and clients would leave. That would make room for new clients. And I had this ever evolving door that was being created by the fact that I was building my business in this way. And when I had reached that first point where I am too busy, that should have been the point where I said, okay, I'm giving notice and I'm moving into this full time, and just trusted that I could have continued the process fast enough to be able to get the income that I needed from it. That game of going back and forth and really killing myself in the process, like getting the clients, then killing them off, and then getting them again, that went on for over 2 years. And at the end of the day, it was basically a coaching session that I had with my business coach, where it really became clear to me that I needed to make a decision. But it also became clear that it wasn't all or nothing. And basically, I went to my boss and I said, look, it's time for me to go, but financially, I'm not ready. So I have a proposal for you. There's one major project I'm working on. Everything else is kind of like extra. Anybody else could do everything else. This major project requires me to be on client site twice a week. How about I stay on to do 2 days a week of work, and here is what I would charge for that. And I basically named a fee that was 75% of my salary. And they said yes. So ultimately, I cut down to 2 days a week and was making most of the money I was making. And and ultimately, at the end of the day, that was what my solution to the problem was. 3 months later, that client stopped paying, and that was the end of that. So I was out whether I liked it or not. But it was the impetus that I needed. It was the push that I needed to just put that behind me. So that's the answer to your first question. Is like the biggest mistake that I had was just not trusting myself enough to be able to take the plunge and do it. And then the second thing is the biggest piece of advice that I could give to somebody who is building their own business, thinking about building their own business, is to get really clear on what it is that you want. I'm in the position now where I work with hundreds of business owners, and most of them have gotten lost on the journey and forgotten why they started in the first place. And the truth is that we usually tend to overcomplicate what we're doing. We usually tend to add on more than we want, make it more expensive than it needs to be. And if you really get in touch with what is the result that you want, what is the lifestyle you want, and you build your business around that, you'll avoid a lot of detours that are unnecessary. And the last thing you want to do is to build a successful business 20 years from now, look back and say, I don't even like what I built. I don't even like where I'm at. And that's what a lot of people are on the path to do. And that's why I work with my clients. The very first thing that I do, I have like a 90-day law firm turnaround program. The very first thing that we do when we start is to go back to the drawing board and identify what their vision is for themselves, for their family, for their personal life. And then how does that translate into what they want to create with their business? So my best piece of advice for you is go back and get clear on what it is that you want, and make sure that what you're building is in alignment completely with that.
No, and I love that, because, that is really, most people start a business, they have a clear goal in mind, they have a reason why they started the business, and yet either because you chase the dollars, you get pushed in different directions or other things. Oftentimes, by the time you get to 10, 15, 20 years down the road, the business is different than what you wanted to do, and you're not even enjoying running the business anymore. So I think that is definitely a great piece of advice. Well, as we wrap up, and before we go, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor in your business, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out, connect with you, or find out more?
Best thing is to go to profitwithlaw.com or search any podcast player and look for Profit with Law. Tune into the podcast. If you're not a lawyer or in the legal services, first of all, a lot of my business friends have said that they really enjoyed the show, even though they're not a law firm, because business is business and there's a lot of really good ideas and good conversations that happen there. But if you know an attorney or you are one, share it, tell somebody about it. It's a great show. And really all the instructions on how to connect with me is buried right in there. Listen to any one episode and you'll find out how to take the next step with us. Go to the website. There's links there as well. That's really the start of the journey, is just get to know me and my brand by tuning into the show and checking out our website. And if you like what you see, reach out to us.
Well, I definitely encourage people to reach out. I love the podcast. I'm an avid listener, and I'm agree with you. For those that aren't on the legal side, I listen to, as an example, Real Estate is one of the podcasts of real estate marketing, because they have a ton of advice that I import over to the legal sphere. I think there's a lot of times when you listen other industries, you can get a lot of insight as to what they're doing well and what they're not doing well, and learn that. So definitely encourage people to check out the podcast, go to the website, and connect and learn more. Well, thank you again, Moshe, for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you listeners, if you have your own journey to tell and you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, feel free to go to inventiveguest.com, apply to be on the show. We'd love to have you. Also, make sure to subscribe and make sure to share the podcast so that we can make sure that everybody can find out about all these awesome journeys. And last but not least, if you ever need help with your patents, your trademarks, or anything else, go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Thank you again, Moshe, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thank you.